who unfortunately cannot be here today because her mother is very ill and she had to go to Chicago. So she asked me to do the introduction, which of course I'm pleased to do. So the first thing is, I gather most of you have been able to help yourself to tea and coffee. And the refreshments that we have are actually Harry's favorite cookies and cake. So this was kind of planned this way.
They're delicious cake, I must say. I can't,
And of course,
I can't
Linda,
restrain myself.
She's not there yet, but she's going to be sitting there to make sure that we get enough cake, and that so she can also listen. And Linda always used to make, whenever we had a board meeting, Linda would make cookies, Harry's favorite cookies. Okay. This is, as you can see, organized as an informal seminar so that we can encourage participation. And this is the Literary Legacy Series, and the first event is the Tea with Sir Andrew and Harry. And it has been in the planning stages, the Literary Legacy Series has been in the planning stages for several years, as envisioned by Harry and Sheila, with the realization that Sir Andrew's literary role has not been sufficiently recognized. And as we know, that Harry has been motivated for many years to really bring Sir Andrew's contributions to the island back to the forefront. And I would like to just read a couple of sentences from The Master's Wife, which we're going to be hearing about much more in this essay. And in the foreword to this book, Harry wrote, "If you just ask about any Prince Edward Islander, which is the island book and the associated place, you'll almost certainly receive a quick answer, Anne of Green Gables and Cavendish. But every once in a while, I'm kind of skipping a bit here, but every once in a while, an occasional island voice will venture another answer, naming a different book and another place in their own way, equally distinguished and special, The Master's Wife and the historic Sir Andrew Macphail homestead at Orwell. And yet, the annual sales of this wonderful grand book that we'll be focusing on today, the sales are in the dozens, compared with the mighty river of visitors overflowing Green Gables at Cavendish each summer, but only a trickle finds its way to the beautifully restored Macphail homestead." And just another perspective on the literary legacy of Sir Andrew, I would just like to read a couple of sentences from the other big authority on Sir Andrew Macphail, Ian Ross Robertson. And Ian wrote, "One exceptional contribution Macphail made to Canadian cultural development in the first 2 decades of the 20th century was his role as editor and ultimate financial backer of the University magazine. The periodical marked a notable advance in the development of Canadian letters. Not only did it provide one of the few outlets for certain types of writings, such as the essay, but it set a new standard of excellence and reached the widest audience of any quality Canadian quarterly at this time. This creative vigor of Macphail was largely responsible for this success, and also, of course, his financial contributions to it." Harry had spent so much of his time over the years designing events to ensure that Sir Andrew's role as a key island and Canadian literary figure received the recognition that he deserved. Tea with Sir Andrew and Harry commemorates Harry's role in that effort and is dedicated in his memory. In addition to Harry and Ian, in addition to Ian and Ross Robertson, Dr. John Flood has been instrumental in reviving Sir Andrew's legacy. And I'd like to now introduce Dr. John Flood and just give a few, many of you are probably familiar with some of his great accomplishments, which I actually was only partially familiar with. So first of all, John received his BA at SDU in Charlottetown, his MA at University of Calgary, and his PhD at the University of Toronto. He taught English literature and language in Northern Ontario for 24 years. He served as the president of Carleton University Press for 5 years. He founded 2 magazines, Boreal in 1974 and Northward Journal, specializing in Northern arts and literature. He founded and still presides over Penumbra Press, which I'm probably mispronouncing, and I apologize, John, which published The Master's Wife and The Book and the Place in 2013. And I was reading the small selection from Harry's foreword in that. And next year will celebrate its 40th anniversary. John has been awarded the Art Library Society of North America's George Wittenborn Award for Excellence of Publishing in the Visual Arts. In addition to all of his academic endeavors, he's also very community-minded. He has served as a secretary of the Benevolent Irish Society, a member of the board of the Alzheimer's Society of Prince Edward Island. He's a past treasurer of the Vinland Society, as we expect anybody who knows Harry to have a little bit more about that. And I think the Vinland Society maybe competed a bit with Sir Andrew. And he's also a past member of the Macphail Homestead Board. He's PEI's current advisor to the Canadian Writers Foundation and is a member of the Island Studies Press Publishing Committee. So at this point, I'm going to hand over the program to John Flood. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Laura. Penumbra Press is correct, by the way. That is the pronunciation.
Yeah.
I was living in the village of Moonbeam in Northern Ontario when I started Penumbra. And I was going to call it Moonbeam Books or something like that. And one of my authors, Carl Schaefer, said to me, he was an artist contemporary of the Group of 7, saying, "Flood, you can do better than Moonbeam Books. Nobody knows where Moonbeam is." So I went to a thesaurus and there was the word Penumbra, and bingo, 40 years later. Thank you very much for inviting me to do this. It's really a pleasure to talk both about Harry and about Macphail, more or less all at the same time. One of the things that I said in the introduction to the book and the place was how we share the stories and the story itself becomes us. I'm extrapolating from that somewhat, and I hope that today this will be such a story, this will be such a narrative that we can share for future generations. I want to thank everybody for participating, and I hope we can do that later on after I've gone through this sort of might be egotistical portion of the evening or the afternoon. But first, though, a little bit of music to set the tone. Things that Sir Andrew Macphail wrote at the very beginning of the book is a man who lives on his own land and owes no money, no one anything, develops all the dignity inherent in his nature. And as I read this over and over again, I was reminded that really this refers to Harry as much as to the master's wife and to Sir Andrew's own father. In a sense, it goes back to the basic principle that Harry lived by, living on the land. The land was his place, was his domain. And we'll hear about how Patrick Kavanagh came into that modality as well. The vain part, or the vanity part of my talk has to do with how I met Harry. And I'm sure many of you who have exchanged emails with Harry will have had similar experiences. So what I'd like to do in a few minutes is to go through some of those email exchanges and just highlight some of the language that Harry used and what eventually led to the publication of The Master's Wife, the book and the place. When we would come back to PEI in the 70s, we heard about this group called the Brothers and Sisters of Cornelius Howitt. And of course, you all know what that was all about. And then we heard about Island Magazine. And I was infatuated by it because the conceivers of these projects were really doing on PEI what I was attempting to do in my little smart part of Northern Ontario, the little town of Hearst, which is where the university is that I taught at, the University of Hearst. The legacy that began then and still continues today through this building, I think, is one that we're all proud of, and Harry certainly is the source of a lot of that pride. When I came back to PEI in 2009, I was looking for an opportunity to continue my community involvement that obviously was now in a different place than in the north. And there's no doubt that I still feel this way, that my soul resides in the north, but my heart is here on PEI. I began very early to realize that community involvement involved many different aspects at the same time. And for me, it was all about the culture that we were embracing back in that period. I became aware of a workshop that was taking place in January of 2010 at the Carriage House. It had to do with the future of the Macphail homestead. And some of you will remember that the big problem then, of course, was heating the building for the rest of the winter. And the discussion around that table, many of you were there, I think. Don, you were certainly there. That was a really interesting and motivating event. There was a facilitator, two facilitators as I recall, and we broke up into little groups and just dealt with what possibilities this homestead had. We brainstormed on a lot of these ideas. And because I'm fairly vocal on such occasions, I was invited to attend the AGM in May, and my name was put forward to sit on the board, and there were only two of us who were nominated, and of course both of us were approved. And that was the beginning of my entrenchment with the Macphail homestead, although it does go back even farther when Eileen and I were dating, and we would come in that window into the homestead here, as many other people did. We've heard Steve talk about that before. And it's funny that we never met others at the same time, because it was a place of happening, as it turns out. The 60s version of the raves. The burning on the floor, that occurred to the building after we came, Steve?
Yeah, we had no part in that.
I served only one term on the Macphail board, though, however, because the reason for coming back to PEI is that my wife had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's, and we decided that the best place for the next few years of her life was back here on the island, her home, her place. And as often happens when spouses go through this process together, Eileen felt that I was spending too little time with her, too much time with other community activities, so she asked that I would leave the board of the homestead, and I did that. One of the things that I did say, though, at that meeting in May, and quite, I would say, in an innocent, naive manner, I was sitting right over here by the window. It was a full house, and Gary Schneider had just spoken about the woodlot project, and it occurred to me, wow, this is generating revenue. Shouldn't some of that revenue be coming back to the homestead as a royalty or as a fee? Because of course the homestead was short in revenues. And Harry replied, "You don't want to go down that road," in a tone that was less directive and decisive than it was advisory or cautionary. And that's the tone that you would hear from Harry, in that very understated tone of his. He also had the ear of the rest of the board, and they all agreed, even though we needed to get revenues from some source or other. Anyway, as I said, I was nominated and voted onto the board. Fast forward a year from there, and Harry and I began an exchange of emails quite regularly, hundreds of them. So what I've done is to extract a few of them to try and create the personality that is Harry and still lives with us today. What I initially proposed is the publication of the proceedings of that symposium in January of 2011, I think it was, on the Book and the Place symposium. And I suggested that why don't we fill out the symposium with 4 additional essays in order to give a broad perspective of the themes that pertain to the master's wife, but also to Harry's own conceptualization of the context of history on the island. I realized also that my own research and writing in Northern Ontario, in a sense, coincided with and even intersected with Macphail, given the people that he had known at that time. People like Pelham Edgar, rather, I always get them backwards. Pelham Edgar was the principal of Victoria College at the University of Toronto, and he was a good friend of Duncan Campbell Scott. And I've been doing research and writing and publication on both those gentlemen. Also, Louis Aymon's Maria Chapelaine, he had translated it, and I also had done a translation and illustrated by Thor MacDonald, whose work I had published a great deal of in both my magazine, Boreal, and a book called Thor MacDonald's Notebooks. And then also that portrait, that lithograph of Sir Andrew Macphail from the First War, when he was knighted, after which he was knighted, I'm convinced was done by Arthur Martin, who was a World War I artist. He was in the medical corps, he worked on the ambulance, and he was an engineer, of course, too, but responsible for laying the railway lines to and from the front. And that style by Arthur Martin is one that I'm convinced is the same of the artist who did that lithograph. So all of a sudden I felt, wow, there's that commonality and it should be pursued. So the series of emails, I'm just going to highlight some of them, and again, I'm sure that those of you who exchanged emails with him will see yourselves in this as well, and this part of the narrative that I think this is all about. In February of 2013, he writes, I've been mulling over the idea of writing something rather memoirish and would like to talk with you about it. I'm thinking along the lines of 20 to 25 short personal essays about various aspects of my own and island life over the past 50 to 70 years. Some of them might be quite quirky. The backstory to that is, the moment I met him, when we returned, I realized this is a man who has a story to tell. Not just one story, but several stories. And they all weave into one long narrative that includes so many of you here. So I said to Harry, why don't you consider writing a memoir? And as a publisher, I would consider publishing it. I didn't actually offer him a contract, which was a mistake because maybe we would have that memoir. In the next month, he writes to me, I'm glad that we spoke again about Richard Lem. There's a reason for that, as you'll see later on. Yes, I do think the Milton Acorn biography to be a fine book, and I was rather put out that we weren't able to publish it through Honest Studies. The reason for that is that I published it at Carleton University Press. And Richard had approached me partly because I had already published Richard's partner at that time, Leslie Ann Bourne, a couple of her books of poetry. And we became good friends, and thus Milton Acorn ended up on my desk, which of course ended up with McGill Queen's University Press. He had also asked if I would talk to Anne Compton about commissioning her to write a play about Milton Acorn, as well as to consider reissuing a new edition of the Poets of PEI. You can see the bug that gets into his mouth and into your ear, and all of a sudden you've got these projects that are just festering, and you think, first of all, yes, I'd like to do them, but who's going to fund them? Who's going to finance them? Later that month, he wrote, the revised preface is attached, the preface that you see here in the book and the place. Let me know what you think. In particular, is the ending okay? For want of a better term, I'd like to consider myself something of a public scholar. For me, that's an aspiration. So two things there. One is that although he was an avid writer, he wrote many, many reports and policies for government and so on. He had no fear in being edited. That's a sign of a good writer, who will accept an editor's remake on his own writing. But the second thing is this term public scholar. And he comes back to it again. Attached as an example of public scholarship, I think, a notice re a public screening of the Old Stock, a Black History Month event. And in that month, I think it was February or March of 2013, the Old Stock was performed at the Carriage House. And this is one of the examples that Harry refers to of public scholarship, as public scholarship. And so we debated what that really means. And it's really interesting to realize how he saw himself in the eyes of others and what he was pursuing, the principles that he was attempting to illustrate for us as his job as a public scholar, and how we would receive that scholarship as part of community building. He then wrote the very next day, attached to something I wrote yesterday for the Carver Commission on the Lands Protection Act, another public scholar sort of activity. And I'd like to quote from the conclusion. I'll say simply that the present generation of Islanders holds this, our homeland, and our home's land in trust. In this sense, it belongs to all of us, and without strong and enlightened public action, the erosion of stewardship, of landscape, of identity will simply continue. It's time for us to draw a line in the land. It's a really interesting irony. This idea of stewardship, the idea of land, the idea of place. And Deirdre, if you wouldn't mind, I'd like you to read that piece on Kavanaugh.
Peace. And sometimes I'm sorry when the grass is growing over the stones in the quiet hollows, and the cocksfoot leans across the rutted cart paths, that I am not the voice of country fellows who are now standing by some headland talking of turnips and potatoes, or young corn, or turf banks stripped for victory. Here, peace is still hawking his colored combs and scarves and beads of horn. Upon a headland by a whiny hedge, a hare sits looking down a leaf-lapped furrow. There's an old plow upside down on a weedy ridge, and someone is shouldering home a saddle harrow. Out of that childhood country, what fools climb to fight with tyrants, love and life and time. Patrick Kavanaugh.
Thanks, Deirdre. One of the principles that Harry believed in that comes from Kavanaugh is that contrast between the parish and the province. And he always chose the parochial over to the provincial. Also in that month, must have been a very productive month for us, because he's wondering about where money is going to come from. And I said to him, why don't you apply to the 2014 PEI fund, because it's taking applications for various projects. And I'd been asked by the Charlottetown Fire Department to put in such a proposal for the history of the Charlottetown Fire Department that I was going to be writing. Of course, we never got the grant, therefore the publication never occurred, at least not as I wrote it. It was done by internal documents from the fire department itself. Harry wrote to me when I told him about this PEI fund and our attempt to access it. Sounds like you also have been drawn into the public scholar line of work. I've had a look at the criteria for the 2014 small grants. Without an unlimited degree of contortion, I don't see how they work for my writing project. Promoting 2014 Charlottetown Conference stuff is the farthest thing from my mind. In March, he wrote to me, I've come up with a memorabilia title, Feeling Harried. What do you think? I was feeling a bit that way last evening. He had just attended a homestead meeting. But what this idea of feeling harried really represents is how Harry embraced life, how he enjoyed life so much. I wrote to him that afternoon saying, feeling harried has a nice touch of irony about it, especially as I don't sense that trait in you. Normally, to me, you appear composed, prepared, and confident, and last night's presentation was quite profound, an eye-opener for me. That was the presentation of the old stock at the carriage house. And then he wrote back, I guess I'm thinking of harried, and this is where you all can identify, also in the sense of all the folks I charm, or cajole, or blackmail, or otherwise persuade to help out with the various projects, like the Black Islanders. Harry knew of my interest in Northern literatures, and also more particularly about Nordic literatures in translation. I had published a series called Scandinavian Literature in Translation, about 10 or 11 books already. And so he approached me with this idea, having to do with Gisli Sigurdsson, who is from Iceland, a proposal for an exhibition of the blood brothers and sisters, the Irish in Iceland and beyond. He also knew of my interest in the Irish Society and so on. And the Icelandic Canadian collection of folk tales and poetry. Harry pitches them to me as possible Penumbra Press publications. There's no end to the stuff that he was proposing. And Penumbra was no longer receiving Canada Council grants or Department of Heritage grants. I'd given them up in the previous decade. And then he writes in March again, I'm having a friend design for me a new personal business card. It will feature a Vinland flag. Yes, here it is. This was the prototype of the Vinland flag. Yes. It will feature a Vinland flag designed by Gisli and me, and also a detail from a 1590 Icelandic map of the North Atlantic, showing Vinlandia as a peninsula about where Atlantic Canada is. The company name is Vinland State of Mind. We did do the flag. We commissioned a large version of it, a regular size version, and we actually put it up at Government House. Government House or Province House? Province House. On Leif Erikson Day of the following year. And we got an urgent message from the clerk saying, we can't do it. The flag is bigger than the Canadian flag. It has to be smaller. So we got out a measuring tape and measured the flag, and sure enough, it was exactly the same size. But what we did instead was to put it a little bit lower, as I recall. The media loved us for it. And so it flew for a whole day. We were quite proud of it. But the Vinland State of Mind, Vinlandia, as Harry referred to PEI, and in 2008, I think it was, Deirdre, that Gisli was here on the island, and the group sailed on from
Oh, that was 1998.
Wow, okay, I'm only 10 years out. So Vinland was already in Harry's gestalt, even back then, in his vision, and he was simply revisiting that vision and trying to recreate the idea of the Vinland State of Mind. Gisli was central to this whole idea. So in March again, he writes, you can Google Gisli Sigurdsson, Iceland, to get a good sense of his scholarly interests and publications. He has gained new insights into the Icelandic sagas, especially the Vinland sagas, by treating them as oral history. His studies in Canada and Ireland have also helped him approach Icelandic saga literature with fresh eyes. He's the editor of the new Penguin edition on Vinland sagas and so on, thinking that PEI is actually one of the stopping off points for Leif Erikson. The key here is how the sagas and oral history are one and the same thing, to Gisli and of course to Harry. Oral history being really, I think, the motivation for Harry as a publisher at Island Studies Press, and even before that, as the founder of the Institute of Island Studies at the University of Prince Edward Island. Oral history really is his forte. Harry is a historian, I think, more than anything else, and his writing emanates from that. One of the contributions to this whole concept of Harry's writing and where history should be, he shared with me in March also of that year, when he recommended that I inform myself about Melissa Mullins' The Past is With Us, and he actually attached this to the email. And one of the things that Melissa wrote about was abandoning houses, visiting abandoning houses with Rob before they were married, and how impressed by comparison between her own family farm home and the way of life praised by Sir Andrew Macphail. And somehow or other the Macphail homestead factors into that, Melissa. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's been a while since I wrote that, so it caught me off guard today. Harry at work again. This old email. Anyway, my boyfriend and I came in through a window back there. And it was the late 80s by then, and it was abandoned, and the burn in the floor had already happened. So, but I was so struck by this place. It was beautiful. We came in through those carved pillars down there, and everything was just overgrown and abandoned, and it made me very sad. And that was one of my very first visits to the island. And we ended up marrying, and my father-in-law, Angus McLean, had such a love for his own farm and his own woodland that when we ended up taking over the family farm and I read The Master's Wife, I saw a lot of comparisons between Angus's view and his love for his land and his home that Macphail had as well. And when we began to raise our daughters on the farm, and we built a sugar house back in the woods and built a cabin, and our girls got to be part of all of that. And even though they're adults now and they've left the island, even at 18 and 19, their love for this place is extraordinary, and they will come back. I know they'll come back, and I know they'll never clear cut that land, and I know they'll never sell that woodland because has such a powerful hold over them. And I've just had so many connections with this place over the years through the girls working at the Macphail nature camp as well. And I'm just so happy that it's carrying on, and that this incredible board has kept it carrying on all these years and brought it back from the brink.
Presumably they had a key to the place. They didn't have to come in through the window. Thanks, Melissa. Harry then wrote to me that he's possibly joining the homestead board. And he says, foolish perhaps, but the homestead has so much potential. Then he also sent me a mock-up of the Vinland flag and said, I'm interested in starting up a Vinland Society of PEI. Interested? So with Harry, Sigmund Keckern, and Nancy Murphy, we became the charter members of the Vinland Society of PEI. What a time that was. And then the next day he writes, well, I've done the deed. Joined the Macphail board last evening. We have a good core group, but we're looking for some reinforcements. Interested? You'd be more than welcome if you were interested in joining. The Vinland Society remains at the concept stage, but I would like to proceed with it. And yes, George O'Connor and his son Ryan would make worthy members. I'd see it in a very informal group, as a very informal group, incorporated, and so on and so on. And another reference to Keesley. The reference to George O'Connor and Ryan, and I know Ryan was on the board here as well. Harry had great, how would you put it, just great regard for George because of what he was able to do with the Benevolent Irish Society, pulling it together out of the abyss from 25 years ago when it was a watering hole and turning it into a true cultural agency in a way that catered to the Irish, not only on PEI, but in the Maritimes and of course in Ireland as well. And I think Harry had visions of doing much the same thing for Vinlandia. And so George was very much a role model for him. They were the same age as well. In April, he writes, as a reply to an op-ed in The Guardian written by Don Mills, who had very negative comments about rural life on PEI. And I was kind of shocked by this op-ed, so I asked Harry if he was going to write a reply or retort. And he says, "I've learned to ignore reductionist writing," which is kind of interesting because it was sort of beneath him at the same time. In other words, to minimalize the view of those who were taking rural living as not too seriously was to give them too much press time in a sense, so ignore it. And then he tried to pitch another project to me, and that was reissuing the Angus MacLean autobiography, Making It Home. There was no end to it, and this is all within 1 year. And then I came up with the idea, as many of us have, of pitching Harry's name for an order of Prince Edward Island. So I asked Deirdre, Jeff Rawling, and Richard Lem to write nominating reports. And I'd just like to read from them, if I may. Jeff wrote, I'm going to put my other glasses on for this one. I know Keane is mocking me for my lack of eyesight here. As all those other things he mocks me for. Harry Baglole had a genius for discerning the subterranean interests of intellectually and artistically lively people and aspects of PEI society. Interests which those people were not fully conscious of, which lurked below the surface of their busy lives. His genius also had the ability to subtly, strategically nudge people into full consciousness of these interests, so that they found themselves enthusiastically committed to projects they hadn't seriously considered or even imagined before Harry began to nudge. There are many islanders who count among their most significant and rewarding achievements projects which began with Harry Baglole offering a gentle, even offhand suggestion after tennis at West Royalty Spa, in the UPEI hallway and the Confederation Center lobby at a coffee break during a conference. PEI owes a great deal to Harry's keen sense of what people might love to do for the island, his practice of the art of gentle persuasion. Richard Lem wrote, "For more than 4 decades, Harry Baglole has advocated forms of economic development for PEI, which are environmentally sustainable, and which embrace social and cultural change while honoring and preserving the island's valuable traditions. More than ever, PEI needs such vision, and Harry's advocacy has been a major reason for the widespread support of PEI for such development." And Deirdre wrote,
Harry Baglole is a futurist. He is and has been a person deeply committed to and deeply passionate about Prince Edward Island and about the wider world, and has long agreed with the vision and practical application of it articulated by E.F. Schumacher in his book Small is Beautiful. We must think globally, but act locally. Harry Baglole is a modest person, content to work avidly, ardently, arduously behind the scenes to bring about positive change that is sustainable for the biosphere and for our rich cultural and historic traditions. He is a person who moves from a big idea and its long-term ramifications to the practical applications of worthy ideas. And a final paragraph. Harry and Alan Rankin and I started Island Magazine, but of course it was Harry's idea. Unpack any of the modestly described items in Harry Baglole's curriculum vitae, and remember how surprised we were at his CV, how modest it was. Unpack any of those items, and one finds that his work has created many beneficial concentric circles of activity. He and two colleagues, inspired by his vision, began the Island Magazine in 1975, a valuable publication now approaching its 40th year. He envisioned and began the Institute of Island Studies with its clear mandate to include outreach to all small, self-governing islands of the world. The books he published through the Institute of Island Studies have changed the lives of Black Islanders and have enriched the understanding of all islanders of the historic Lebanese Syrian diaspora and of fragile PEI ecosystems, the Bonshaw Hills, the Ian Quarry's book, and traditional island fishing and farming practices. We forgot music, I forgot to write, and folk music, folk traditions. Anyway, the results of all these glowing letters
is that we are still waiting for Harry to be awarded the Order of PEI. But I think later today we have an honor that is being bestowed upon him. What I'd like to suggest then is that these reports to the Order of PEI and the emails that I've extracted from in Harry's voice, they articulate the single most principle that guided him through life. Purposeful social contribution, the essence of public scholarship. In fostering conversation about big ideas in the arts and humanities, in rural and social environs. Like Sir Andrew Macphail, Harry was himself a Renaissance man, a generalist and a specialist at the same time, a larger-than-life figure whose vision was simultaneously utopian and quaint. I should probably say homespun rather than quaint, because when describing Harry and David Wheel once to our premier, he used the word quaint, and I don't think he meant it in the same manner. A dreamer and an activist, a leader and a worker. In a view expressed in the production notes to the 1977 publication of the Chapel Diary, Ron Irving writes that through extensive research and copious documentation, Harry supplied his own appreciation of dramatic form, his sensitive ear for dialogue, and his writing skill. As in a manner of improvisation, the text evolves, this is my writing now, and transforms along the way between actor and audience. Still, such change occurs not only to the people engaged in the exchange of dialogue, actor and audience, but to the place itself. It's one thing to change ourselves, it's another thing to change the place. In the case of the Chapel Diary, the colony of PEI, New London in particular, this is where that change occurred in the Chapel Diary. As an aside, I think it is fitting that one of Harry's final contributions to public scholarship was editing John Cousin's book on the Quakers colony of New London for Island Studies Press, completing the circle, as it were. The backstory to Harry writing, producing, and publishing the Chapel Diary is, as Ron Irving describes in his notes, that Harry had devised a course in island history that was originally created to demonstrate a method of explaining history through the use of dramatization as an effective means of understanding and appreciating the past by living the history. In a sense, that's what a teacher does, is to live the history no matter what the discipline. In part then, the play is about visionaries such as Robert Clark and Walter Patterson, who anticipate creating a better place for the inhabitants and newcomers, a place of redemption perhaps, even perhaps with the religious zeal and sense of humor of Sir Andrew Macphail. And in that I'd like to read the poem that Geoffrey Berlin Lindsay wrote called The Spirit, which is the frontispiece to the preface that Harry wrote to the third edition of The Master's Wife. There is a winding path that curves through a little green and lovely wood with trees that softly sway, led by the gentle breeze. Along it slowly moves a man, but who? And nearer draws the man. But as he comes closer, he seems to fade, to grow, so misty dim, a fleeting shadow. Ah yes, it is the spirit, and it has been wandering through that heavenly little wood, as essence ever since he died. For when alive, he loved this place, and now and then he reappears. And then from where I stood, I saw him slowly come to shape and softly creep towards me. He said, "Awake," and I awoke from sleep. That to me is the essence, the embodiment of both Harry and Sir Andrew Macphail. And now maybe a little bit of music. There's a reference in the chapter on music. I might just read it because Harry has some views on this that he seems to disagree with. Page 212. The violin was unknown except among the Irish. It was considered a dissolute instrument. The performer on the violin always strove to enforce the rhythm by trampling with his feet to give the effect of drums.
Actually, I think Sir Andrew was a bit misguided in not recognizing the amazing Scottish tradition of fiddle playing on Prince Edward Island. And he kind of derogatorily refers to the Irish. I'm not sure why he missed that, but there would have been hundreds of Scottish fiddlers in this local area. Many of them probably would have spoken Gaelic. So, anyways, there we go. Would have been the Acadian fiddle.
That very rhythmic sound and tone and so on does represent another aspect of Sir Harry Macphail, Sir Andrew Macphail. Should we knight Harry as well?
Yes.
The joy of living that Harry, I think, represented to everyone can be reflected also in music. I'll trade you places.
So this is a song that Harry, who we love, asked us to learn, myself and Kian, and he did say this is one of his very favorite songs by Ewan MacColl. So we'll try that for you now. With an improvised situation here. This is a little drone that goes with it, so. Farewell, you northern hills, you mountains, all goodbye. Moorlands and stony ridges, crags and Each of you bears inside of you the gift of love. May it bring you light and warmth and the pleasure of giving. Eagerly savor each new day and the taste of its mouth. Never lose sight of the thrill and the joy of living. Take me to some high place of heather, rock, and ling. Scatter my dust and ashes, feed me to the wind, so that I may be part of all you see, the air you are breathing. I'll be part of the curlew's cry and the soaring hawk, the blue milkwort and the sundew hung with diamonds. I'll be riding the gentle breeze as it blows through your hair, reminding you how we shared in the joy of living.
Among the joys of living, of course, is poetry. And on page 133 of The Master's Wife is this very interesting comment. I think it's 133. Do you remember where it is?
Maybe 132.
132. As poetry, it is not very good. The reference to where poets must go. It had to do with this, that if you were not very good at writing poetry and claimed to be a poet, there was only one other place for you, and that was the pulpit. Deirdre, however, as we know, as poet laureate, has never been on a pulpit. And will read for us the poem called Marriage Feast. Is that what we're going to do? Or do you want to read the intro to that?
Nor would anyone ever want me on a pulpit. What Sir Andrew Macphail, as most of you know, published what he entitled The Book of Sorrow, poems that he'd been collecting years and years and years. He mourned for his wife. He was married for only a short time before his wife died. But he didn't publish the poems until the war, when he was engaged overseas in the war. And what he wrote, this book published in 1916, and in his preface he writes, "For many civil years, it was a melancholy pleasure assembling these pieces and putting them in order. Now there is ample warrant for completing the task and offering as a comfort to other hearts what in the outset was designed for private luxury." So he didn't publish it when it was his own sorrow, year after decade, over his wife, but now that the world was suffering, and that reminds us of Harry looking beyond, as Macphail put it, private luxury. The poem is called The Marriage Feast, and it's one that Sir Andrew wrote himself. I, from whose heart young love is long time gone, beyond recall, and in his secret place dull sorrow soothes with sad averted face, her restless sister pain with visage wan, handmaidens of the shadow-footed one, who comes more slowly than the season's pace, creeping around the year. I wish you grace, as you stand glorious in life's morning sun. Your blood-red lips are eager at the brim of that deep cup, now amply poured for you. Drink with closed eyes, nor look upon the lees. They only quaff whose joys are memories. Drink of the bubbles sparkling at the rim. The dregs are bitter, and your hours are few.
The chapter on music in The Master's Life elucidates a great deal about how Sir Andrew perceived the role of music in education, particularly as a kind of language in and of itself. He wrote a lot about how words were not to be trusted. It was the emotion and the sentiment behind those words that had greater value. And language itself had to be very carefully used so as not to misrepresent those thoughts or feelings that resided behind the words themselves. There's one more poem that I'd like Deirdre to read. It's called Illusion, and it deals with grief. And I think to bring the two together, Sir Andrew Macphail and Harry Baglole's legacy, this poem in many ways represents what we are here for today, followed by a tune by Kim.
Illusion. Beloved, spring is come. Do you not hear the strong south wind's deep breathing in the trees? With all the lusty joy of youth, he frees their limbs from bondage of the winter drear. Nor yet the bird notes rising high and clear above the merry whistling of the breeze. Will you not answer if I join with these my cry of longing and of love most dear? Should I but nestle close beside the mound this night, with ear alert, the grave might yield unto the spring and love some whispered sound, that all this weary time you only dreamed, when snows of winter leveled all the field. Oh God, how very far you seemed.
I began by talking about how sharing stories is itself a story. The process of that one narrative combines to represent all of us. So I've been doing all the talking, and the musicians and so on, Deirdre as well. Thank you very much. We could perhaps now share your stories about Harry and how they intersect with the master's wife. There are many, many themes that do coalesce, and in all of them, I think Harry seems to be present. Anyone like to share their thoughts on what your experience with Harry?
Perhaps we could go around and introduce ourselves,
Sure.
because most of us know, but we don't, maybe we can, Doreen?
I'm Doreen Hustis. I live next door, and I'm currently president of the board. And I had a phone call from Harry, like many of us had. I'm actually quite good friends with his ex-wife, and anyhow, she must have given him my name, but suggested I come out to a board meeting, and the rest is history.
I'm Sandra McKinnon. I'm also serving the board. I originally grew up and I'm still involved with the family farm that's on the Kinross Road, which is the next, just across the creek, is what I say. And my experience is quite similar to Doreen. Harry phoned me, and actually Doreen and Harry took me out for lunch one day and cornered me. So, but it's probably one of the better things that I've done as far as volunteering. So, yeah.
My name's Don Patton, and I had the pleasure of serving on the board for a period a while back. 2010 was mentioned, and then I was the target of Harry's art of gentle persuasion, and ended up back on the board for a period, and very happy to have played that role.
I'm just here. My most experience with Harry is fielding phone calls.
Yeah.
Is Donald there? And if not, we chat for quite a while. And he was wonderful to talk to, and sometimes I fear I was trying to shelter Donald from yet another request. But
Yeah.
anyway, he was a wonderful person, and we all miss him.
And I'm Naomi Bont. I didn't know him personally, but I've come to quite a few lectures here, and I did enjoy when he spoke.
My name's Joan Cumming. I didn't know Harry personally either, but I'd just like to pay tribute to the people that I met on Prince Edward Island since I came here 30 years ago, who have left a legacy of historical research for the rest of us to enjoy. I think of Wendell Boyle, Ed MacDonald, Boyd Beck, Harry. I've read the Island Studies publications. I have a whole bookcase of these are my island books. Nobody at the bed and breakfast gets to put their hands on them without my permission. So I treasure that there are people like him, and I hope there will be many more to follow, because if we are not instilling the love of our heritage, and particularly built heritage, because I'm really into architecture, then we'll be doing the younger generation a disservice. So keep up the good work at the Macphail House.
I'm Paula Kenny. I didn't know Harry either, but for decades and decades he was always this name on the scene of anything that had to do with heritage and history, and it was kind of a mythic figure as far as I was concerned.
David Keenly side. I met Harry many years ago in connection with Island Magazine, and when I was working here on the island in the 1980s. And I didn't really get to know him very well until I came back 2007. And of course, as many of you know, Harry was, as has been repeatedly said, he was a great enabler, a great visionary, somebody who started the process, and we all sort of followed in line and carried on with so many of these ideas, and many that did come to fruition. He is really missed for sure, and but it's great in his tradition. In many ways, his legacy is what we're talking about today, and will continue on, because he had that momentum that he instilled in everybody to keep on doing the things that he loved and all of us share. So just really missed very, very much.
I'm Catherine Dewar, and I've known Harry since high school. And didn't know him well then, but I knew him a bit. And then sort of didn't make contact again to the time of the brothers and sisters of Cornelius Howard, because I was one of the card-carrying member. And you're right, Harry was an ideas person. He was always behind the scenes. And when I got involved, and we can thank Steve Sherritt here for this, he did an article on this house that was falling down, and I saw it and got in touch with some people and eventually established the Friends of Macphail. Harry wasn't involved at that time. He sort of, Harry, behind the scenes, telling you what you should do, maybe. How to do it. And at some point he said, it'd be an awfully good thing if you went out and interviewed the people that worked with Macphail back in the 20s and 30s. And at that point, he was the director of the Institute of Island Studies. He said, I could find a few dollars for mileage. So I did 19 interviews of people who had worked here and remembered Surrender Macphail. And that essay is written up in this book. So he was, again, behind the scenes with Macphail, wasn't actively involved at that time. And then I think we just had contact over the years with a lot of things that he was always phoning you and saying, I think it'd be a good idea if you did. And I said, no, Harry, and he wouldn't be listening to you whatsoever. He would be talking right over the top of you and say, fine, okay, we've got that settled. And the first thing you know, you're doing something and you have no idea that you're going to be doing. But that's how he did it. He was a visionary, and he was behind the scenes with a lot of things, and I'm really sorry he never got the Order of BEI.
Yes.
He certainly deserved it for so many reasons. You see a box here today. I'm cleaning things out, and these are records of the very early meetings of the Macphail homestead. The top one I see is July 4th of 1989, which would be that we were organizing a tea to raise money to try to get a roof and try to stabilize the place so it wouldn't fall down. And it's all our, I don't know, would you like me to read a couple? No?
Yes.
No? No?
Yeah, read a
Or
couple.
you keep- yeah. Okay, this is, I didn't intend to do this today, by the way. Harry's here somewhere. July the 4th, 1989, it was minutes. The Friends of Surrender Macphail, the meeting was in the Orwell Farm Hall. President Catherine Dewar, Fred Horn, Jack and Eleanor Pennick, B. Mayer, chairperson, Harold Martin, Wendell Boyle, Walcott McPherson, Ruth Van Eyerstein, Alice Mall, Sue and Everett McLeod, Isabel Clark. There were only three of us still alive. Dee read the agenda, the Liberal Government Committee. I was on that. The Papers for Incorporation and the Macphail Tea. So these were our three projects. And of course, the Liberal Government Committee were off to see the Liberal government to try to get the money. And we had tried with the Minister of the Environment, who told us it was a good idea to take Eddie's matches to this whole place. So we got Isabel Court, said, you know Joe Giz, she knew him, her sister had gone out with Joe Giz. You phone him and say, you want to talk to Joe Giz? And so she phoned, and they said, oh no, we'll refer you to the Minister of the Environment. She said, no, that's not the directions I have for my group. We want to speak to the Premier. So we got a meeting with the Premier, and three of us spoke, and I had a feeling, you had a gut feeling that he was listening to us well. Gilbert Clemens was saying things, and Joe was politely telling him to shut up. And anyhow, they called an election at he called the election at the Uick Hall. I was driving home from work, and I heard we got $150,000 for restoration here. Nearly went in the ditch.
But anyhow, I'll say we did things, so it's, but anyhow, these are interesting. I'm leaving these here. I put a whole collection of pictures over the years of different events that have gone into the provincial archives. And there's also another file in there on Macphail. So, but it was a lot of fun in those days. We had fun trying to keep this old place from falling down. And you can thank Steve, he did a lot of articles that stirred people up. And ticked off I'm sure you ticked off somebody down there, yeah, that's close to you. So, I wouldn't say anything more.
My name is George Arsenault, and my first contact with Harry Baglole was probably 1974. He wrote to me asking if I would submit an article for the Island magazine, and I believe it was my first article I wrote in English, and it was published in the second issue, I think, of the Island magazine. So he got me writing for the Island magazine, and since I probably wrote about 15 articles, or maybe less. But anyway, he was always very supportive, and I'd get emails also, but never really asking me to do things, but usually asking for some information. But I had very high esteem for all the work he did, and like others, I think, and I had been thinking of that for a while, why he hadn't received the Order of Prince Edward Island yet. So.
Do they give it posthumously? Or?
No, they don't.
I'm Alan Stanley, board member. I got Harry a little earlier this year. I had a call from him. I met him briefly over the years, and he gave me a call, asked if I'd be interested in being on the board. I said I didn't really have time for that, and he said, "Well, just come out for a meeting, see what you think." There'll be soup, and there was good soup. So I kind of got looked in that way. So I didn't know him well at all. We've only met face to face once or twice over the years. But seemed like a very interesting man. Very pleased with what he had to do.
Are you not Sir Andrew's great grandson?
I am.
Yes.
Look at the picture of the master and Alan. I think there's amazing.
I am Kathy Muldoon. I did not have the opportunity to meet Harry Baglole, and obviously it was an opportunity missed on my part.
I'm Nancy Malcolm Sherritt, and we knew Harry socially since we came here, in 1980. And Steve and I used to love coming down here and coming in that window and looking around and walking through the woods, and we had great dreams of how we could buy it and make it some sort of home and restore it, and we knew we didn't have enough money, so Steve went to Plan B. And anyway, so we're just delighted that this fabulous place was restored, and many thanks to all the people who worked so hard to do that.
Well done, my dove. My name is Steve Sherritt, and I'm on the board. Because Harry knew how to push all my buttons in a lot of ways. I've known Harry for a long, long time, and he was a great fellow, as we all know, and I'm glad he knew how to push buttons, because I benefited greatly from him pushing buttons. Through music, I mean, I did more musical things with Roy over the years. Through Harry, I mean, he just worked his magic in many ways, and all of a sudden, you know, you'd find yourself doing a musical gig or a heritage gig or something. And he also knew how to push my button to call and Steve, I've got a story for you, you know, something about Macphail. And the next thing you know, there'd be and he knew I loved this place, so he really knew how to work me. And he's a great guy.
And you were in the Chapel Diaries when we first arrived, right?
Yes.
I didn't even
Harry
realize
wrote
that
the
was
play
Harry's.
with Ron, yeah. And I was the balladeer. And we went to the Canada Games in 1984, 5, or something like that. Well, yeah. Anyway, yeah. So I've known Harry since back then, and wonderful guy, and terrible loss, but a great, I mean, he did so many things to this, for this island, it's just amazing.
In an early incarnation of the Chapel Diary, I was Betty Chapel. We did 17 performances
Around the island?
Around the island.
Oh,
And we went
right.
to Ottawa. I think that's when I first met
Okay.
Keenly Side. And Alan Rankin was the balladeer.
Okay.
And Glenda Landry was the other woman in the play.
Wow,
Of course,
star-studded cast.
she should have been the star, not me. Anyway, it was October 2011 when we were all here for that Macphail Day that led to the book and the plays, and it was a wonderful success. I mean, a whole day, so many of us were here. And afterwards, it was doing a post-mortem on it with Harry, and I said, it was a great, rich day, such a great success, good idea, this book is going to come out of it. And then I snidely said, because Rob and I were doing excerpts for that day, and then I sort of snidely said, it's too bad nobody really talked about Catherine Macphail, the master's wife. And that was it. He said, you're writing that, aren't you? I said, well, okay.
And I think and it's a wonderful, wonderful, and it really gives the feminine perspective that is kind of really missing a bit from.
A little bit, yeah. I was it was hyperbole on my part, but.
Yes, and I'm Laura von Zitwitz, and I'm also on the board, and this is my 6th year, so I'm at the end of this, so I have to retire for a year. And it's, yes, and it was, Harry was just amazing, and I think really we're all trying to live up to his vision of what can be accomplished. And we really want to thank everyone for really participating,
Well, we
especially.
didn't hear from.
Yes, no, yes, go ahead, sorry.
Sorry,
Yes,
sorry to interrupt
yes,
you.
no.
And around.
I'm Simon Lloyd. I'm with the library at UPEI, and I think that's how I first met Harry. I do remember that when I started at UPEI in '99, I was looking to learn more about the island culture and heritage because I worked at the Prince Edward Island collection there. And one of the first PEI heritage lectures I ever saw was Harry Baglole speaking at Beaconsfield, so I couldn't have had a better introduction than that. And yeah, I always found him, and of course once Harry knew that I worked with the library at UPEI, our paths crossed a few times, and I always liked, I mean, he always gave the sense of being very dedicated and very driven in a way, but there was also something really gentle about it. And I find either in person or via email, I appreciated that John read some of his emails, because yeah, Harry's voice could come through in emails as well as in person. And yeah, just something I can add to what else, except I'm on the board too now.
That happens.
And happy to be so. Anyway, thank you.
And I'm Diane Fleck, John's sister, and I guess that's how I know Harry is through John. And my encounters with Harry weren't that much, but my thoughts were that he was a regular guy who liked to have a beer. So we thought we'd see him at the old Triangle. So.
I'm Melissa Mullen, and Harry and Rob and I were working on a big project very dear to Harry's heart when he died, and about Sandy Ives, based on his memoir and some of his books that he wrote about island folk singers. And several days before Harry died, Rob and I went to visit him. We were actually working on the play, the Playwrights Colony in New Brunswick, and we heard and we came over, and Harry immediately said, I have 2 partners organized for you. When I'm gone, you need to connect with John Cousins and Marion Bruce and keep going. And then he said, I have another project I'd like you to start. Find this beautiful book, illustrated book on PEI. Go home and find it. So we did. We found it that night at home, and Harry had given it to Rob's father years ago, and we took it into Harry the next morning, and he told us what he wanted us to do with this, and he never
Wow.
stopped. This was a few days before he died, and he's still tapping me on my shoulder. I've been working on the play this week, and I just feel Harry going, Melissa, you haven't been at this for a while, you better get going. So, he's very much inside here.
Hi, I'm Mary McIlvery, and this is May, and this is Xavier. And we met Harry when one day I decided to call the Provincial Archives to find out about more about the history of folk singing in PEI, and they said, "Oh, there's someone you should call." And so they gave me Harry's name, and I called and spoke with Harry. We ended up having a great chat for about 20 minutes, and he just had such a kindness and a warmth and a genuine interest in bringing people into the fold of these good things, and I became one of those people that was brought into the fold of some good things. And so Harry became one of our best friends, because later he met Kian, who was my partner, and he became one of our best friends, and we were very inspired and are still very inspired by Harry. And we actually created a little festival here that happened at Macphail, and we had a great time doing that. And it was a sort of a Scots Gaelic festival with a lot of good things that happened. So, you know, we're always looking for inspiration and for projects to be working on. So if anyone wants to talk to us about things like that, we love that. And speaking of singing, we love the music, and now May and Xavier are doing the music, and they love to sing, and they're doing fiddling and step dance and whistle playing, and they sing too. So we love all that good stuff. And we're happy to be here. Thank you.
My name's Roy Johnstone, and Harry was a neighbor of mine, so we spent a lot of time either snowshoeing over to Harry's or skiing, and having sampling his baked beans or his chili that he had out there every day. But just was thinking of in response to Melissa's comment about Harry at the end when he was in palliative care there. He was planning the memorial service, and he was already counting out the money. He said, "Geez, I think we can make a couple of grand for Bonshaw Hall." That was, and I mean, like Steve said, we had so many fantastic experiences because of Harry's initiative, and he was a guy who concerned about the economics and all that other stuff. But he was also really committed to culture and the arts, and he really encouraged and supported that. And that's unusual to see that often in somebody. He wasn't just a historian, maybe like he was really an activist in the community with a strong love and passion for the island, and we got to share that joy with him and all those experiences with him. It was incredible. Deeply missed.
Yeah. Ian is my name, and I met Harry through Mary, and from the very start, I could really appreciate what an amazing person he was, the depth to his character, the wisdom he had, but most profoundly was his love for the island. I had just moved here to Prince Edward Island, and he would speak with such passion about the people here and fitted in with everybody, whether it be here in a board meeting or sitting inside in a kitchen, with farmers and fishermen and singing songs and playing music. And when I moved here, lots of people would say to me, "Oh, you're from away, you're from away." And Harry never said that to me. He just, looked where I could fit into the community, and he did that and helped me to meet people and connect and become part of the community here. And for that, I'm really grateful and really special to be here, to be able to play music for him, because his spirit is still here.
Thank you.
The one thing that nobody's mentioned is that Harry and David Leal were sort of, when they were both in government, the vision behind the Rural Renaissance in PEI. And Angus McLean was the premier. They had a sympathetic premier.
And Harry was it was his project, as I understand it, to bring George McRoby so much part of the homestead. Again, another wonderful outcome that many might not have known about or even imagined.
Is he the one who started the Ireland Lecture Series?
Yes.
Well, I was one of the lecturers, maybe not the first year, but the second year. I did a few, and then I moved to Moncton for 10 years, and I got involved with La Société du Monument Lefebvre in Memramcook, and we were looking for an activity for the monument during the summer, so I was inspired by that lecture series, and we started that in the summer of maybe 89 and 90, and it's still going on. And when I've come back to the island, I started one in Scotia at the Acadian Museum in the summer on that same theme, and it's still going on the last 12, 13 years.
In a way, you kind of made it transparent how you do things, the how-to. Oh, we started a lecture series. How do we do that? We get the people who know the most about a particular subject, and we ask them. Rather than all the funding machinery and the big proposals and all of that to start, you ground level.
And the same with The Master's Wife, creating the stage play. You and Rob had done readings from that. The light bulb went off for Harry. He got us to do readings the next summer, and a few of them over the summer. And you just start by getting hooked in, making it happen. People get excited, then you go for funding.
Yes.
And because you've already got something launched.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was Harry. It's amazing.
And one day we visited Harry, and we loved to go visit Harry out at his house. One day his garden was in full bloom, and we went out to visit him, and he insisted that we pick some things and take them home with us. He had made this beautiful soup that we talked about for a long time afterwards, and we could talk about it today and remember it with happiness the way we did then. But we brought our friend Owen Baglole out, who was here visiting, teaching Irish at the university, and we went to Harry's, and I just know that was one of the best days that I'll ever have in PEI. Something about Harry and how much he loved PEI and loves PEI and is PEI now. We had the soup, and we went in the garden, and we walked around in the woods outside of his house where he had done some tweakings here and there by moving some flowers and clearing some things. And his level of satisfaction in that moment and in that day, just to have a visit and to appreciate those things, it was just so real. And we walked up over the hill with Rafiki and Owen, and just his contentment at doing that was just so real. And he brought us into that with him, and we talked about that soup for a long time. We'll have to try to make it someday. But anyway, those moments with Harry are moments that I'll treasure and remember. And his love of friendship, as well as being pushy to get projects done, which was a great mixture.
Yeah, the microcosm of that love. We went to Maine last fall, and he was telling us about how Keith had bought the woodland next to his house. And that was the most wonderful thing for him, because he knew it wouldn't get clear cut. That land was safe for the future, and that the woods was going to stand. It's very, very important to him, this little world there.
Okay, so first of all, we want to really thank our performers and John for putting together this really wonderful.
Our conductor.
Our conductor. And we have one more element. Now we want to make sure that you are getting cookies that Linda made, that are Harry's favorite cookies, and we have some more cake. And maybe we'll go do this final portion of the event, and I'll introduce Doreen for that. We have something very special that we're going to do, and then if people could come back and help themselves to food, we'd really love that. Doreen.
Well, this is not the order of PEI, but we memorialized Harry here by planting a tree in his honor that we can show you later. And the plaque we have done says Harry Baglole, 1942 to 2018, a tireless supporter and visionary leader of the Sir Andrew Macphail Foundation.
Very nice. It's lovely. I'll look at that.
Yeah. so there'll be a place here where he'll always be remembered as well as being remembered in our hearts. So, yes, you like more tea or coffee? I don't know, maybe we should just,
Do we want to go to the tree first, or,
we could do that, sure.
and then come back for,
Okay.
and then people can decide their schedule. So the tree is planted,
Yeah, we had to plant it earlier just for the time of the year and availability of manpower and so on, but,
and the tree was donated by Barry, and Barry assisted in planting it.